and welcome. I'm Julia Bryan-Wilson. I'm the Doris and Clarence Malo Professor of History of Art and Director of the Arts Research Center at UC Berkeley. I'm also an adjunct curator at the Museum of Art, Sao Paulo. And I'm here today with Favianna Rodriguez as part of my lecture class at Berkeley called Visual Activism. And I want to say hello to all of my students and also thank you to the Latinx Research Center, which is co-sponsoring this event. And of course, the words visual activism bring a lot of things to mind, but for me, first and foremost, it puts me in mind of the conjunction between aesthetic practices and social justice. And Favianna is someone who I've been really inspired by for a long time, and I'm just delighted that she said yes to this invitation. I also want to mention that both Favianna and I are zooming in from Oakland, California. It's been a very hard month in terms of the pandemic and also fires. And before we begin, I wish to acknowledge that Oakland occupies the unceded territory of the Ohlone peoples and to pay respectful tribute to this land as their ancestral home. With her wide-ranging work that spans art, graphic interventions, posters, and grassroots organizing, Favianna Rodriguez is a central figure for any discussion of contemporary art and social justice. Among other things, she is the co-founder of the East Side Arts Alliance and co-founder and president of the Center for Cultural Power. She has received numerous awards honoring her work around incarceration, queer resistance, racial justice, climate change, and migration, including the Robert Rauschenberg Artist as Activist Fellowship, an Atlantic Fellowship for Racial Equity, and the Soros Equality Fellowship. Please join me in welcoming Favianna. I want to say that questions can be posed in the chat, and after Favianna has concluded, I will be posing questions taken from that chat. So Favianna, I just want to turn things over to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be joining you. I 3 years and was a part of the Third World Liberation Front that helped secure some win for ethnic studies. I have very fond memory of the president's office and of the Campanile, and just excited to be in virtual community with you and to share more about my art. So we are going to go ahead and get started on the presentation. And can everyone, I'm assuming you could see my screen, Culture is Power. And for the first few screens, I'll just be describing them just to make sure that they are moving at the right pace. So culture is power. Culture shapes our understanding of the world around us. And when I was growing up and I first became an activist, my mentors taught me that there was people power, there was earth power, and there was money power, and that all of these different forms of power could be leveraged in our movements. And as the more I became an artist and merged my activism with my artistic practice, I began to understand that culture is also a very powerful lever of social change. This slide is a slide of an ocean, of a wave. Culture surrounds us all the time. It shapes who we are as people, as societies. The stories that we share shape our political systems. As human beings, we have understood the world around us through art and through science. And I like to think of culture as the ocean, and the ocean, which is in constant movement. When there is a political win, whether that's the legalization of gay marriage or the election of the first Black president, the wave has turned. There is a major shift, right, in our political landscape. But the ocean makes those conditions possible. Culture makes those conditions possible. And as an artist, I am part of a community of culture makers that are helping create shifts in the ocean that are going to have lasting impacts. And just like a body of water, when you throw a rock into a body of water, it has ripples. And culture can be changed by one person, one individual, such as Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee to protest police brutality and actually helped create an entire movement, which we're witnessing today. I grew up in Oakland, California, in this state, and I was raised in a immigrant family, in a mixed race immigrant family. My father was Afro-Peruvian. My mom was Peruvian. They migrated to the US in 1968. And actually, my father worked for many years as a dishwasher in a restaurant on Telegraph Avenue that used to be called Mario's La Fiesta. And since a young age, I had a lot of visual expression. And I believe that was the case because I was growing up in a community that was very impacted by the war on drugs, right? It was the 80s. And my community, the Fruitvale in Oakland, was one of the most impacted. I mean, Oakland was one of the top cities that was impacted by the crack cocaine epidemic. And for me, growing up, witnessing violence, whether it was gang violence or police brutality, really impacted my experience as a young person. And art was a way for me to create another space in my imagination. And it was also a way for me to kind of cope and to create a world on my own terms. This picture on the lower side is my grandmother and my great-grandmother. And it's very important to me to acknowledge my Afro-Peruvian history, because I think that what racism does is that it really creates a false binary, right? It creates the binary that the world is very black and white. And often when we think of Latinx people, we think of a concept called mestizaje, right? Which is the mixture of Spaniards and indigenous people. But in reality, the majority of slavery happened throughout Latin America. And not only did I feel sort of disappeared by American culture, because we have such little Latinx representation throughout the arts and throughout film and television, but there was also the disappearance of an Afro-Latinx identity. And when I would turn on Spanish language television, I would just see light-skinned Latinos, Latin Americans, and that also affected my perception of myself. And it's one of the reasons why I was so committed to being an artist, and why culture is the space that I am committed to, is because the representations, what I saw in the pop culture around me, whether it was on billboards or on television or in the books that I read, in the museums that I went to, the erasure of Latinx people, and in addition, the erasure of our indigeneity and our African roots, had a huge negative impact. And it's a part of systemic racism. I also want to add that growing up in an immigrant family, my parents did not want me to be an artist. They wanted me to be a engineer or a doctor, because neither of them went to college. I was the first person in my family to attend college. And so I went to UC Berkeley largely through the math, science, engineering route. And it was at UC Berkeley where, through an ethnic studies class, Chicano studies actually, that I met an artist that actually opened the door for me to become an artist. And it was a special workshop. It was Laura Perez, who is still at UC Berkeley, had invited a Chicana artist to teach us about linoleum block printing. And it was then when she really saw my craft and invited me to be a part of a women's workshop at Self-Help Graphics in Los Angeles. Now, Self-Help Graphics was back then one of the most significant Latino printmaking centers. So as an artist, I have really found my own way. I did not go to art school. I ended up dropping out of UC Berkeley after the TWLF fights, just because all of our grades really went down after all that activism. And I became an artist on my own terms, and that was in the year 2000. But I want to tell you about some of the influential things that really shaped my understanding of the power of visual activism and really the power of culture in order to affect social change. So these are some of the key experiences when I was growing up. So first is that the US-Mexico border, the creation of the border. It was in 1994, when I was 16 years old, that NAFTA was passed. And 1994 was a real critical year because at that time, the president talked about this concept of free trade in which borders did not exist, in which capital could move freely between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And also in 1994, there was a law passed here in the state of California, a proposition which was Proposition 187. And Proposition 187 was eventually overturned by the courts, but it was one of the most anti-immigrant pieces of legislation ever. And it was the first time that a state took on immigration policy, because prior to that, immigration policy was largely part of the responsibilities of the federal government. But when Proposition 187 happened, what I began to see is on television, these messages of illegals, right? That these illegals are taking our jobs, they are taking your jobs, your American jobs, they are invading, and they are bringing with them crime. And at the same time they're taking their jobs, somehow they're also very lazy and they're absorbing from the welfare system. And these narratives created a very anti-immigrant and really anti-Latinx environment that would have impacts for years to come. And in fact, we're still experiencing what began in 1994. So I see 1994 as the beginning of the contemporary nativist and anti-immigrant movement, right? Nativist meaning white nativism movement. And so when Bill Clinton signed NAFTA and talked about the opening of borders, it was before that, this is what our border looked like. It really was, there was no militarization of the border as we know it now. But that same year began the militarization of the US-Mexico border and this metaphor that we now know as the wall. And so when we think about the power of metaphor, especially of a visual metaphor like the wall, we can't underestimate how politics uses stories and symbolism to drive its agenda forward. And equally, we have the same ability and power to also shape politics with the images and stories that we create. Because after all, it was these anti-immigrant narratives were simply stories, right? They were stories of fear that began to be popularized. And when I realized that in 1994, it was also when Three Strikes You're Out got passed. And it was the last year of affirmative action, and which was also headed up by the UC Regents. And so I was the last incoming class to the UC system under affirmative action policies. And so California was just like not the state it is today. We were a very pro-prison state and a state that gave birth to the anti-immigrant movement. And it was in that context that I really found my activism and specifically my role as an artist to know that the stories that I wanted to tell were actually the stories that would work to combat and alleviate the false stories, right? That how do we create stories of inclusion and stories where we belong and stories where we see each other. And a very powerful example of that is the AIDS quilt, which AIDS was another pandemic. And it was something that was overwhelmingly killing gay men. And for years, Ronald Reagan did nothing about the AIDS crisis. He ignored it purposefully because of his homophobia. And, Ronald Reagan, it's worth saying that he was also the president that slashed the NEA, the National endowment for the arts. And we're still living through the implications of that. He slashed it so much precisely because he was homophobic and because he knew that the arts was a way for new ideas and progressive ideas to emerge. And so it was the AIDS quilt that really caught my eye when I was young, because it was an example of how people can show their stories through a visual medium and really show the power of what happens when you unite many stories and you grieve, right? And I think it's a very important model for us today, because as artists, we could help people grieve, we could help people process, but we could also show our outrage through art. And that is the power of art. And that is something that shaped me as an artist, is to think about how art could transform narratives and also be a place, be something beautiful that people can heal from, can use to heal and to have conversations. This is the community in which I grew up, the Fruitvale neighborhood in East Oakland. And if you noticed, my neighborhood is sandwiched in between two freeways, the 880 freeway and the 580 freeway. And when I was growing up, I would notice that a lot of people in my community had asthma. In addition to recognizing that I lived in a food desert, I lived in conditions of food apartheid, because overwhelmingly there was fast food and liquor stores, but very limited options for real nutritional whole food. And if you look at this map, which is from the Callan Biro screen, you will see that the areas of orange and red are right near where I live. And this was the situation for decades in my neighborhood. And that is that my neighborhood suffered from pollution. Now you might ask yourself, why does the part on the lowers by the 880 freeway look red? And why does the part by the 580 freeway up top look green? Well, that's because the people who live in the hills are predominantly white, and they organized so that trucks would not pass through their neighborhood, so that diesel trucks would not pass through their neighborhood, which meant that the brunt of emissions and of trucks going from the airport to the Oakland port, which is one of the busiest ports in the country, that the brunt of pollution would be along the corridor where people of color lived. And this is the situation for East Oakland and for West Oakland. In fact, there are parts of West Oakland which are referred to as cancer alleys because of the high rates of emissions, because of trucks, right, burning fossil fuels. And so when I was younger, I didn't necessarily connect the dots to climate injustice, but the more I began to learn and understand how my neighborhood was unjustly polluted, right, while the white neighborhood just 2 miles up did not have to breathe the toxic air, it really shaped my activism as a climate leader, which I am today. And I share this because as artists, I don't believe in doing art about issues. I think that as artists, we create intersectional art. Our art, the themes that we do are often about lived experiences, and they are about human conditions, and our human condition is often intersectional, right? It intersects many different issues, not just one. And for me, I was dealing with gender inequality, racial inequality, the impacts of drugs, the impacts of gang violence and pollution. But that's not unique to me. That's the situation for many, many, many people of color, especially Black and Latinx folks growing up in urban environments. So as an artist, I believe that the things we live through, the things we experience, give us a unique perspective of the world, right? And that it's that perspective which is what we need to depict and create. And so, for example, my perspective as somebody who grew up in a polluted community is different than the perspective of a white homeowner in the hills who doesn't have to deal with pollution. But unfortunately, so much of what we're seeing in the culture around us is actually through the white male gaze. And it's precisely the reason why we need to be fighting for cultural power, because without cultural power, we're not able to experience the perspective of other people, especially oppressed people. And so if you don't see what I see, how can you join me in my fight for liberation, right? How do you see it? How can I help you understand and see it so that you can work with me to help solve these things? And this is, I think, one of the driving kind of concepts of my artistic practice is to show a different kind of perspective that has actually been obscured by design. And so if we consider, for example, that the majority of museums in this country have collections that are about 85% or more white male artists, we're seeing just one perspective, right? And these are museums that I went to as a child, that many young people go to, and yet the number of Latinx artists are probably very few and in no way reflective of our actual presence, right? If you really even look at this state, Latinos are about 40% of the state. Latinos are actually the largest racial group in California. And yet the culture around us, especially the visual culture, does not accurately represent us. And what happens is that we don't get represented in politics, right? Laws are created. Again, laws are created as a result of stories. So this image here is of our planet, and it was taken in 1969, 1 year before the first Earth Day. You know, talk about the importance of a visual experience. When this photo was taken, it changed humanity, but it also transformed our relationship to the planet. And that was very evident with the first Earth Day in 1970, which created all kinds of environmental wins, including the creation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the creation of the Clean and Safe Water Act, Endangered Species Act, et cetera, right? There was dozens of laws that resulted from Earth Day, which goes to show you the power of how we see, right? What we see and our ability to change our perspective, because obviously when we see this, it reminds us that we are all in one home. We have one home. I mean, you don't see any borders on here because the earth doesn't create borders. And so it affects us in a very unique way. So this trifecta here, culture, politics, economics, represents how social change happens. Now, social change happens in three realms: in the cultural realm, in the political realm, and in the economic realm. And often when we think of social change, we think that it only happens in the political realm. But in reality, politics is the slowest to move, and culture moves much faster than politics. In fact, a law is the final manifestation of an idea whose time has come. But in the realm of culture, we create that idea. And so, for example, Ellen DeGeneres, which was a TV show that came out when I was a teenager, right? The TV show Ellen. Ellen DeGeneres was the first queer person to come out on primetime television. And this was in 1997. Prior to that, the depictions of LGBTQ folks were non-existent, or they were extremely problematic. And so when Ellen came out on TV, what happened is that Ellen broke through and created a cultural moment. And what followed was the creation of shows like Will and Grace, Queer Eye, The L Word, and little by little, the LGBTQ experience, although it was a very white experience as we were seeing it on TV, became more and more normalized. And it shifted culture. Before you knew it, you had people in sports coming out on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And that was in 1997. It wasn't until 2015 when the Supreme Court ruled that same-sex marriage was legal. So it took 18 years. And what we know about culture is that culture moves fast and culture moves ahead of politics and economics, and it shapes it. And so even if we don't have political wins, culture is changing. And that's very evident, for example, right now, with the, as we're witnessing the national Black uprisings and the demands to defund the police, right? There's a culture shift happening. Now, some cities, less than 5, have actually taken measures to defund the police. And politically, I mean, the conversations that we see in the political realm, politicians are not ready to even talk about defunding the police, right? But culture has changed, and we are at the beginning of transforming a very oppressive system of policing, which has unjustly targeted Black and brown people. So culture is powerful, and the ideas that we create in the culture realm affect the political realm and the economic realm. And when I talk about culture, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the universe of creation, right? The universe in which stories are created and made, art, music, fashion, technology, television, and film, and social media content. And it's in these spaces that we are creating new symbols and images and stories, right? That are constantly shaping the world around us and are introducing ideas, right? And so as a artist and as an organizer, I'm very interested to have unity among our cultural workspaces, right? Because at the same time, many of us who work in this realm we're the precariat workforce, right? We're largely freelancers. Artists today, as a result of the pandemic, 2/3 of artists are unemployed. So we have to begin to see ourselves as workers and as a group of people that needs to be organized. So my work is that I'm an artist and an activist, and I have created a career for myself that really merges both. And as you heard, because of my lived experience, I want to address the systems that harmed me and my community, right? And those systems are unjust incarceration, unjust immigration laws, racist immigration laws, food systems, right? Climate injustice, climate chaos, gender inequality, and racial inequality. And I create art about those things because those are the things I've experienced and I continue to experience today. I continue to live in the Fruitvale, and we still have a problem with pollution that ends up costing years of life. And so people who live in the flatlands of Oakland live about 10 to 12 years less than those who live in the hills. And in my art, I depict these issues as well. So this piece is something that I did for the People's Climate March in 2014. It says, Defienda nuestra madre, defend our mother. And using the concept of our mother, right? Our Mother Earth, but also our mother, and also portraying a woman of color as a key protagonist in the fight against climate change. Because for too long, when we think about climate change, we think about white guys, right? You have Leonardo DiCaprio, who's one of the faces of fighting climate change. And yet climate change disproportionately affects people of color. But climate change is also the product of white supremacy. It's the product of colonialism, right? Because climate change exists because we have exploited the land. And the idea of exploiting the land and who's exploiting the land is not everyone has exploited the land equally. I mean, the history of colonization and what the European countries did to this land is directly tied to what we're experiencing today. And if we even point at the fossil fuel industry, the heads of the fossil fuel industry are overwhelmingly white men. And where are oil extraction sites? Where are they put? They're put in communities of color. So communities of color often live in dirtier spaces where oil is being extracted from, and we suffer the consequences of that. So not only are we breathing polluted air, our homes are where oil is extracted from. Same with indigenous communities. Indigenous communities are often the ones fighting the fossil fuel industry because fossil fuels are not, the whole concept of how we have to get oil out of the ground is really a violation of Mother Earth. And indigenous people have been saying that for many, many, many years. So we are at a time now when we can finally imagine the end of oil, because as a result of the pandemic, oil is literally sitting out in barges in the ocean, and the price of oil has dropped. But this is exactly also why we have to be politically active, because we can't bail out the oil industry. The oil industry just has to die. This is another one of my pieces, the centerpiece here, Migration is Beautiful, which was largely inspired by Black is Beautiful, as well as Gay is Good, which is, these were concepts from the 60s and 70s that were about framing the beauty, right? Not just our fights, but the beauty. And the concept of migration is beautiful is about recognizing that we are a part of nature and nature moves. All human beings throughout history have migrated. Like, that is our human condition, is we move and we migrate, just like other species, like butterflies and salmon and birds. We move, and it's a part of who we are in our species, is that we have to move. And migration is beautiful because it's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's how pollination happens. It's actually how nature has organized itself, is that migration is a necessary part of that. And so this art piece is an invitation to imagine a world without borders, and to look at migrants like butterflies, right? And the monarch butterfly specifically is a species of butterfly that flies from Mexico through the US and Canada and back. And it does it through generations of butterflies. So what would it be like if we recognize that immigrants are like butterflies and that they are also pollinators? I mean, they're literally harvesting our food in the United States, right? But also that, how do we protect them? How do we help support them and view their journey as something beautiful as opposed to something criminal? And as an artist, these are the questions I want to ask. I am not sure, I don't think borders are going to disappear in my lifetime, but it's important to recognize that borders are man-made. They are a construct. The earth doesn't have borders, and borders don't really exist for the wealthiest people. Borders don't exist for a lot of people who have privilege and power. They exist to keep people out, and they exist to keep people out after we've robbed them of their natural resources and of their ability to care for themselves. So I love to imagine and think about what a world without borders could look like. And my art has like made it everywhere. And, even in front of elected officials. This piece actually is in Kamala Harris's office as well, which goes to show just the power of a symbol, right? About how we don't just need to define what we're against, we also need symbols for the world that we want, the future that we want, and how powerful it is to have symbols that people want to display in their offices, right, or in their homes, because as somebody myself, I am somebody who recognizes that museums are not necessarily the spaces where I want to show my work, precisely because they have already excluded people like me for so long that it's not where I'm going to reach the people I want to reach. And so how I'm constantly thinking about how my work can end up in classrooms, right? I mean, pre-COVID, obviously. Now some of my work is in digital classrooms, right? But pre-COVID, my work was everywhere, in classrooms and streets. And now, of course, with technology and with social media, all of that is moving towards a more digital realm. This is also a piece that I did with Ben and Jerry's, Pecan Resist, and my art on ice cream pints, right? How cool is that? I mean, that's a big kind of goal for me, is that my art is reaching pop culture spaces. I'm not interested in my art and my visual images being in exclusive spaces. I really want it everywhere, right? On stamps, on ice cream pints, on billboards, on clothing, because that's how I can shape public and popular conversations. Now, another concept to share with you around the power of story or the power of an image is the concept of constellations. And so when somebody shares their story or an image or a moment, that is a star, right? So when the story of Oscar Grant first was shared across the internet, Oscar Grant, who was murdered here in my community in the Fruitvale BART in 2008. And then we heard the story of Trayvon Martin, and then Mike Brown, and then Sandra Bland, right? When stories illuminate, they illuminate and other stories follow, and we can then form a constellation to recognize that these are not isolated stories. These are a part of a pattern. And when constellations are visible, we can see them in a way that allows us to connect with them, and they are no longer obscured. They actually begin to form something more powerful and visible. And so stories are meaningful, images are meaningful, actions, right? For example, the student at, I believe it was Columbia, who was sexually assaulted and who did a performance art piece in which they carried their mattress onto the stage and had a lot of other students help them with the mattress as a way to protest the university's lack of action around their sexual assault. And so, and then of course, creating momentum for others to share their stories about sexual assault at their universities. And that's the power of the story. And another evidence of the power of how stories beget more stories is the Metoo movement, founded by Tarana Burke. Metoo was a coin that Tarana Burke founded many, many years ago, but it was popularized in late 2017 when Alyssa Milano shared it on a tweet. And how many more stories came out? And it's not that those stories didn't exist. It was that we didn't see them. And so when we see them all together and they form constellations, we can't ignore it anymore. And, going back to the concept of culture, politics, economics, Me Too has changed culture. Has it changed politics? No, not yet. I mean, Brett Kavanaugh got elected to the Supreme Court. But Me Too made it possible to even listen to the testimony of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. So Me Too had a cultural impact, but we're not going to see a political impact for many years. And that's how culture works. But it doesn't mean that we stop making culture. It means that we go harder on culture. And because the more culture moves, like, the way in which we are seeing right now, sports teams from the NBA to the WNBA to Major League Soccer, wear symbols that align them with Black Lives Matter, that is going to create cultural momentum. And then we just don't go back, we move forward. And that's the role of culture, is that we're always going to be 10 or 15 years ahead of policy change. So in my last few minutes, I'm going to kind of zip through these slides. But first is that the cultural sector is inequitable. It's really controlled by white men. And an example of that is Hollywood, right? Hollywood, 96% of film directors are men, 94% of film executives are white. And so if you wonder why you're seeing what you're seeing, is because of this, right? We have abysmal Latinx representation, Asian representation. I mean, even Black representation. It feels like a lot, but it's not a lot. Indigenous representation. I mean, Indigenous people are practically invisible. And that is because of this. And, speaking of Latinos, look at this, 4.5% of Latinos in the most major films, right? They're just missing. And this is throughout the years. Even though Latinos make up 40% of this state and Los Angeles, where Hollywood is based, I mean, they make up a huge part of it. And yet this is the representation, which of course affects the way people see us, because Hollywood is exporting stories, not just here in the US, but Hollywood is exported American culture. So it's a problem when American culture is designed just by these guys. And this is all of the cultural realm. I mean, museums are the same, dance, publishing, performance, gaming, they all look like this. So what does it mean? How do we move forward? First is that we have to imagine what our yes looks like. In this image, the action and ideas. Often when we're taking action, we are taking action against something, right? We're taking action against pipelines. We're saying no to police violence, no to sexual assault, no to the fossil fuel industry. But we also have to be about our yes, right? Which is the world of ideas. We need new ideas and images and symbols that show us the yes. Because we can't just be about the no. We also have to show what kind of world we want, and what does it look like, feel like, smell like, what is it, how do we experience it? So I'm moving into the final section. Sorry that we're going a little faster, but the final section is I want to tell you all how you can take action as artists and as people who care about visual culture. So first is that we currently are facing 4 major threats, and we have never, as human beings, faced a pandemic that has changed our culture so rapidly, right? The pandemic has transformed our culture at a pace that we have never seen before. And so we're facing the pandemic, we're facing the climate crisis, we're facing systemic racism and an economic crisis. And so this is a unique congregation of these things. And it's very hard, but it also means there are huge opportunities for us to tell stories and to create art and images about these things. You all No, but Black people and Latinos are dying. They're the majority of people dying from COVID. And so I'm gonna skip this just because I don't have time. But my organization created a guide called No Going Back, which you can download, which shows artists and creative how to talk about, how to make art about the future that we want, right? Which is everything from healthcare, a clean energy economy, shutting down prisons, protecting the most vulnerable. How do we talk about the future while we recognize the systems of the past that did not work? I also am very much engaged in the elections. Now, this is the most important election of our lifetime because the stakes are extremely high. As you all saw from my first slide, COVID, climate crisis, economic crisis, and systemic racism, all of those things are being aggravated by the current administration. And so we have to really think about voting. And I know that people have mixed feelings, but the other issue is that voting this year is going to happen like it's never happened. And so we have to actually shift our behavior, right? We're going to have to vote by mail. We're going to have to do drop off. This, with my organization, we've created a storyteller's guide, which you can see the link right there, bit.ly storyteller's guide, around how we can create the narratives that will get people excited to vote. And here you could see one of the most recent posters that I did on the right, which vote for her, vote early, in person, by mail, Dropbox, right? Obviously, I'm talking about vote for Mother Earth, and that you got to vote early, right? And so the stuff around voting is so confusing that we need to tell people what to do, right? We need to tell them, vote by mail, vote early, do a Dropbox, or go vote in person, because telling someone to vote is not enough when there is so much misinformation and confusion. So thank you so much for allowing me to do this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. And here is where you can find me on Instagram. Thank you.
Favianna, thank you so much. That was profound and engaging and really, really powerful. I do have some questions from my class, and I also have some questions from myself. Suddenly there's like a noise outside. Sorry about that. This is this question from my wonderful student. I have amazing students in this semester. Her name is Quetzal. Can you speak a bit about your experience not only being Afro-Latinx, but as a Peruvian American? Did you feel any additional forms of otherism within a predominantly Mexican American community? Was it ever a challenge for you to comfortably allow yourself to artistically represent the entire Latinx community?
Yeah. That's a great question. So first, I grew up in a largely Chicano Mexican American community, and my parents were, a lot of Peruvians don't choose to live with. A lot of Peruvians, they kind of like, because of how hard it is to migrate, Peruvians tend to kind of choose places to live that are not the barrio, right? But I grew up in the barrio, and my parents chose to live in the barrio because they ended up creating businesses that largely worked with immigrant populations. So my mom did taxes, and so did my dad, and they did a lot of like translations and helping immigrants with their papers and all that stuff. Just in general, just supporting other Spanish speakers, and so I had a unique experience in that I didn't really grow up with Peruvians besides my family. And in my family, I think, I think that this is an issue for a lot of Afro-Peruvian families, but we didn't really talk about our Blackness. We didn't really talk about, my grandma didn't really even acknowledge it. And I think it's because of the pain of how bad racism was in Peru. And so and not just that, is that we couldn't go back to Peru because there was a lot of political problems in the 80s and 90s. And so we would always go to Mexico because my mom was a travel agent before the internet was created, but never to Peru. So I didn't get to go to Peru until I was like 18 years old. And so as a result, my identity and my my experience is largely, it's very pan Latin American, because I also lived in Mexico City, where I learned about Bolivar and like all, I learned Latin American history. But I think, yeah, I think that I feel like the complexities of being Latin American are not demonstrated in our culture. And that's something I try to do through my art.
Thanks for that answer. I had a question that comes from me, from myself, Julie Bryan Wilson, which is actually about your uses of Latin American history, and how I love how you described using art to kind of envision a future world that we want to make for ourselves. But I also notice a lot of indigenous references and motifs in your work. So I was wondering if you could talk about, how you turn to the past as a resource in a way for a future.
So I wasn't exposed. I mean, actually, when I was growing up in the United States, up until the age of 12, a lot of what I saw, the symbolism I saw, was Peruvian, Mexican, and like Central American, Panamanian stuff. So my mom would bring home Panamanian mulas, or, we would have a lot of artwork with Inca references, or, my dad in particular loved all the Mayan sculptures, and he would always bring things for our yard that were very symbolic from Aztec and Mayan culture. When I was 12, things got so bad in my neighborhood, and my mom got shot at, that I asked my parents to send me to live in Mexico, because I just couldn't take it anymore. I mean, I was just like, what the hell? It's so dangerous here. And I spent 3 years in Mexico City. And that's when I learned about Frida and the murals and the codices. And I also had art class in my school, in my school in Mexico. And that is, I think, what really made for me especially the codices, is to see and actually learn about this, because I wasn't learning about this in American schools. I actually didn't know anything about my own Latin American history. I never learned anything about that, besides maybe the Alamo in American schools. But in Mexican schools, I got a really wide Latin American history, and I was exposed to art, and I was in Mexico City, which itself is like an artistic city. And that formed the foundation of my symbolism. And it's also why I do profiles, very influenced by the codices. And why I do the noses that I do and the lips that I do, is because I always wanted to show what my characters look just like my family members.
Great, fantastic. This is a question again from one of my students, Olivia. What do you think are some of the best tactics to get out these visual messages without relying on commercialization? And she's thinking about how so many social movements in America have been appropriated by advertisers.
Yeah. So I think it's first important to create art that is available in many mediums, right? So when I make a drawing, I make it so I could share it on social media, but also so that I can make a printed poster and give it out. Like I make an actual physical object. And even though, so I didn't grow up with computers. I didn't start using computers until I was like, maybe 13 years old. But for a few years, I really leaned on computers for art, but then I just got sick of it. And I went back to all my analog practices, which is how I learned from my mentors. I learned screen printing, wood block, linoleum block, Xerox art, right? All the punk rock style stuff, because this was pre-computer. You didn't do desktop publishing, you did Xerox cutouts. And so the analog traditions to me are very important. And when I make my art, I do it in an analog format. And then I turn it over in digital. Now I'm combining again a little bit more, but I really try to stick with analog, because for me, it's about retaining these activist art traditions and making a physical object. Like I love physical objects. And I think that when you're making your art, like make it into a poster, make it into something that you could pass out, but also have it on social media, have something you can download, have a black and white version that people can color in, have something people can put on their homes. It's really, I think that there's nothing like holding a piece of art in your hands. And so as much as possible, I make my posters.
Yeah, you've really taught me something, I think, about translation across and between genres, about repurposing a similar image, but that can appear in so many different formats, and how that really expands your reach, like,
Oh,
it's,
yeah,
it's wheat
absolutely.
pasted. Oh, it's a sticker. Oh, it's like,
But also as an artist, I sell my prints, and social media helps me sell my prints, but sharing my art on social media is not going to bring me money. Selling the prints is. And so I also think that as artists, we have to always keep an eye on how we can sustain.
Absolutely. So this is a question from Katerina. What is your favorite piece you have ever made?
Oh my gosh, what is my favorite piece? So I have a bunch of pieces around that concept. And yeah, I think my body of work around sexual freedom, because I grew up in a family that was very much about negative messages about sex, right? Close your legs, don't get pregnant, don't go out, don't touch another human being. And those were very harmful messages. And I believe that as oppressed people, especially coming from people who have been physically, like their bodies have been, used in service like a commodity, that it's very important for me to feel freedom in my body. And I'm so happy that I am the first generation who could actually express that without shame and punishment, but who could also make art that will last, beyond me for the next generation.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that you come from this feminist and queer perspective that is, as you said, it's about rage, it's about grief, it's also about joy and pleasure. I think that you express all those so beautifully. Well, I just want to thank you once again, and thank everyone for joining us, and remind you to check out Favianna's social media sites, support her, buy her prints. She's doing such important things. I'll just also say we have a couple of upcoming lectures that you might want to check out. You can always look at our website, arts.research.edu. I'm like now suddenly like, is that what it is? It's arts.berkeley.edu. Sorry. And our next event will be next week, September 22nd, Alfredo Yar, the important Chilean social practice artist. And then on October 8th, Devi Peacock, who's one of the co-founders of Peacock Rebellion here in Oakland. Ooh. So Favianna, thanks again. It was really, really wonderful to hear your work today.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.